The door of the county marshal's truck had not fully closed when the chain hit the concrete. It landed in two pieces, the padlock swinging loose on the last link, and the sound carried all the way across the gravel lot to the second pump, where a man in a gray wool overcoat stood with a gas nozzle in his hand and his hat pulled low against the November wind. He did not flinch at the sound. He turned his head slowly, the way a man turns when he already suspects what he is going to see, and watched the marshal lift the chain from the ground and loop it once around the door handle of Caruso's Market. Wait, because what happened in the next 30 minutes, on the corner of South 4th Street in Steubenville, Ohio, on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in 1961, was witnessed by 4 people, recorded by none of them, and kept in near total silence for over 40 years. And when it finally came out, nobody who heard it could explain why a man at the peak of his career had stopped at all, or what it cost him to walk back across that street. The reason it stayed silent that long had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with a kind of dignity that is almost impossible to explain to anyone who did not grow up poor in an Ohio river town. The man at the pump finished filling his tank. He set the nozzle back in the cradle. He did not move toward his car. Steubenville sits on the Ohio River at the eastern edge of the state, pressed between the water and the hills that in November go the color of old iron. The Wheeling steel plant had been cutting shifts since 1958, and by the fall of 1961 the downtown was beginning to show what happens when the mill coughs. Storefronts with brown paper in the windows, men on corners at 10 in the morning, the river smell carrying further than it used to, as if the town had gotten quieter and the water louder, and in that quiet, a lot of things were waiting to be lost. Caruso's Market stood on the corner of South 4th and Market Street, 2 blocks from the river. A narrow brick building Enzo Caruso had leased in 1938 and run until the spring of 1960, when a stroke took him between the flour sacks and the pickle barrel. His son Tony had been working the counter since he was 12. He was 28 when his father died, unmarried. His mother Rosa in the apartment above the store. A younger sister at Ohio State on a scholarship that needed topping up every semester, and the money for that had been coming from the pumps. The market was not large. 4 aisles, a deli case along the back wall, a small produce section near the front window where in summer Enzo had displayed tomatoes from the garden behind the building. Tony still grew the tomatoes. He still put them in the window in August. He still cut the provolone the way his father had cut it. Thin enough to see light through, his father always said. Thin enough to read a letter through if you had a letter worth reading. 3 things he kept. 3 things he would not let go of. Because letting go of them felt like letting go of the man who built the place. What Tony could not do was make the numbers work. Enzo had operated on relationships, long credit lines, a running tab in a green ledger updated in pencil so he could erase it when a man had a bad month. Tony kept the same ledger, the same pencil. What he could not keep was the margin, because the wholesale prices had moved and the neighborhood's ability to pay had not. And by August of 1961 he was 3 months behind on the lease and carrying a supplier balance he could not see his way around. The letter from the Jefferson County Courthouse had arrived on a Monday. County letterhead, 2 pages. Outstanding debt referred to the marshal's office. Premises subject to closure pending payment in full. Enforcement date the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Tony had read it 3 times. On the 3rd reading his hand had gone flat on the page, as if pressure alone could change what was printed there. It could not. He folded it into the green ledger and gone back behind the deli case and cut provolone for Mrs. Juan Ferraro, who needed a quarter pound and did not need to know the case would be empty by Thursday. He had not told his mother. He had not told his sister. Telling people things you cannot fix is a particular kind of cruelty that Tony Caruso was not willing to practice. Notice that, because it matters for everything that comes next, the silence was not weakness. It was the shape his father had left behind. Now it was Tuesday. The marshal's truck had been parked at the curb for 11 minutes. The marshal, Gerald Purcell, 9 years in the office, a man who did not enjoy this part of it, and had in fact driven past the block twice before pulling up, stood at the front door with the chain in his hands and the county notice in his breast pocket, and had been standing there longer than he needed to. Inside, Tony stood behind the deli case with his hands flat on the glass, wearing his father's apron, white with a blue stripe, washed and pressed that morning by his mother, who did not know why he had asked her to, and the asking and the not knowing had nearly broken him before the day had properly started. Howard Settle from the 1st Federal Branch had arrived 7 minutes before the marshal and stood near the register with his briefcase on the counter. He was not unkind, the kind of man who had learned to move through foreclosure notices efficiently, though this one, he would later think, had been different. Settle had placed the enforcement notice on the counter and gone through it. 3 months of lease arrears at $410 per month. Supplier balance of $610. Total enforced amount $1,840. The property would revert to the lessor. Inventory held pending assessment. Tony had listened to all of it without interrupting. When Settle finished, Tony looked up and said, "Can I have until Friday?" It was not quite a question the way he said it. Settle looked at his briefcase. He was sorry. The date was set by the court, and the date was today. Marshal Purcell came through the front door, chain in hand, and the small brass bell rang the way it always rang when a customer came in. Ordinary, cheerful, indifferent, and that sound was the thing Tony Caruso would remember longest about that day. Not the chain, the bell. Purcell set the chain on the nearest shelf, next to canned tomatoes. He looked at Tony, then at Settle, took the county notice from his pocket, and set it on top of Settle's on the counter. He picked up the chain again. "I'm sorry, son," he said. He meant it. Tony nodded. His hands were still flat on the deli case glass. He was looking at the counter. There was a man standing in the front doorway. None of them had heard the bell. He was perhaps 44, medium height, gray wool overcoat, dark felt hat, still on. He had not shaved in 2 days. His eyes moved across the room with the economy of a man who has spent his life reading rooms, who has learned that the first 3 seconds tell you almost everything about what you're walking into. He had been at the second pump of the Gulf station across the street when the marshal's truck pulled up, watched Purcell sit in the cab before getting out, watched Settle go in first. He finished pumping his gas, paid inside, came back out, and stood beside his car for what the man at the counter later described as about 2 minutes. Then he crossed. He did not hurry. Look at him for a second, because this is the moment the whole story turns on. One man crossing a street. That's all. And nobody in that room knew yet what it meant. He stood inside the door with his hat on and his hands in his coat pockets, and looked at the 3 men in the room. Tony looked up from the counter. The man looked at the chain in Marshal Purcell's hand, at the 2 notices on the counter, at Tony. "Can I get a 1/4 pound of provolone?" he said. Tony blinked. The man waited. Tony straightened. He reached under the counter for the slicer. His hands moved to the deli case, the practiced motion of 10,000 mornings, and he pulled the provolone from the case and set it on the board and began to slice. The slicer made its sound. The room was otherwise very quiet, except for the 2 men who had come to take the market, and the one who had not. Settle looked at the man in the overcoat and did not recognize him. Purcell looked too, and also did not recognize him. The hat was low, the collar up, the shadow of the doorway working in his favor, and besides, Purcell had been looking at the floor more than anything else for the last 10 minutes, as if the floor were the only thing in the room that wasn't asking something of him. The man in the overcoat walked to the counter and looked at the 2 official notices lying on the glass. He did not pick them up. He read them where they lay, slowly, the way a man reads something he intends to do something about before the hour is out. Tony wrapped the provolone in white paper and set it on the counter. The man looked at it. He looked at Tony. "Your father cut it thin enough to read a letter through," the man said. Tony went very still. Enzo Caruso had said that. Tony had heard him say it 500 times, to customers, to Tony himself, to the wall when he was working alone on a slow afternoon, but Tony had not said it out loud. Not that day, not in this room. He looked at the man across the counter. The man was looking back at him steadily. How do you know that? Tony said. The man reached into his coat pocket. He set a $20 bill on the counter next to the provolone. I used to come in here when I was in town, the man said. Your father knew how to cut provolone. He knew how to do a lot of things right. Tony had not yet placed the voice, but something in him was starting to. Tony's hands were on the counter again. He looked at the 20. He looked up. Keep the change, the man said. He picked up the provolone. He did not move toward the door. He turned and looked at Howard Settle. Settle had been watching this exchange with the mild discomfort of a man who has a schedule and is being made to wait. He had his briefcase open now, the enforcement papers inside, ready to be processed, and he had no idea what was about to happen to his morning. How much? The man said. Settle looked at him. I beg your pardon? The total. The number on that notice. How much? Settle glanced at the notice. $1,840. Court ordered. The man had already reached into his inside coat pocket. He produced a wallet. Dark brown leather, worn at the corners, the kind of wallet a man carries for 15 years because he doesn't think about wallets. He opened it on the counter, and Tony still had not placed the voice. Tony said, Mister, I don't know who you are, but I don't take charity. My father didn't, and I don't. It's not charity, the man said. It's a transaction. You give me the best sandwich in Steubenville, I give you something back. Your father would recognize it. Tony stared at him. The slicer was still running, the belt going around and around, with nothing on it. The man counted bills onto the counter. He counted slowly, not quickly, not showing off. Each bill flat and distinct. He counted 18 hundreds and 4 tens. He pushed the stack across the counter toward Howard Settle. Receipt, he said. Today. Paid in full. Write it on bank letterhead and sign it and stamp it if you have a stamp. Settle looked at the money, then at the man. Something in the voice, the cadence, the stillness, had begun a slow recognition he could not yet complete. He took out a sheet of First Federal letterhead and uncapped his pen. He wrote the name, the address, the amount, paid in full, lease current through February 1962. Signed it. Pressed his notary stamp into the corner. Blue ink, sharp smell in the cold air. He handed the receipt across the counter. The man picked it up. He looked at it once. He set it down in front of Tony. Tony looked at it. He looked at it for a long time, and he still didn't know, not yet, that there was one more thing. One thing he hadn't mentioned. One thing the man had not yet said. Stop for a moment and picture what that receipt meant. February 1962. Rosa upstairs who didn't know. His sister finishing her degree in Columbus. One piece of paper. One morning. One man who crossed a street when he didn't have to. His hands came off the counter. He put them in his apron pocket. He was doing the thing men do when they do not want anyone to see their hands shake. And it was not working. Marshal Purcell had set the chain down on the shelf next to the canned tomatoes. He was not sure what to do next. Nothing in 9 years of marshalling had prepared him for this, and he was the kind of man who, when unprepared, waited. The man in the overcoat looked at him. Marshal, he said, you don't need to be here. Purcell picked up the chain. He picked up the county notice from the counter, looked at Tony, looked at the receipt, and folded the notice back into his breast pocket. He walked to the door. The bell rang. He did not look back. Settle closed his briefcase. He looked at the man once more. Recognition closer now, not quite arrived. May I ask your name, sir? The man was looking at Tony. Ask him. He'll know it in a minute. Settle nodded, picked up his briefcase, and walked to the door. The bell rang again. The market was quiet. The belt on the slicer was still running. Tony reached over and clicked it off. The silence afterward was so complete that the sound of the river, 2 blocks away, came through the front window. Tony looked at the man. The man had his hat back a little now, and the light from the front window, gray November light, the kind that flattens everything, fell across his face for the first time. Tony Caruso was 28 years old, grown up in this store and in the sound of his father's radio, Bing Crosby, Perry Como, the occasional ball game, and there had been one voice his father always stopped for, always turned the radio up for. Had once, on a Sunday afternoon in 1953, sat on an overturned crate with his eyes closed for 4 uninterrupted minutes while the store went unattended and the voice on the radio sang a song about the moon. Tony looked at the man's face in the gray light. His mouth opened. He closed it. He opened it again and said nothing. The man waited. He had the patience of a man recognized 10,000 times. The moment of recognition is fragile. It does not need to be rushed. Tony said. The man picked up the provolone from the counter. He turned it in his hands. Your father, he said. Your father used to put a little black pepper on the board before he sliced it. Did you know that? Tony's eyes were wet. He was fighting it with everything he had, the way men of that generation fought it. Jaw set, shoulders back, breathing through the nose. He said, "He never told me that." The man nodded. "Little things," he said. "The little things are the ones nobody writes down." Tony would spend a long time trying to decide if that was wisdom or an apology. Tony looked at the receipt on the counter. "Mister," he started. The man raised one hand. "Not high, just enough." "It's a loan," he said, the easy certainty of a man who has thought this through. "Not a gift. I don't give those. Your father never took those either, I'd guess." Tony shook his head. "No, he didn't." "Then we understand each other." The man pocketed the provolone. "When you can, you send what you can. No schedule, no interest." He took a small notebook from his breast pocket, wrote a name and address, tore the page out, set it on the counter. "Write in the memo line what it's for, and he'll know." Tony looked at the page. He looked up. "I'll pay every dollar," he said. "I know you will," the man said. "That's why I came in." Remember that line? The only explanation he ever gave. Tony would turn it over for the rest of his life. Not pity, not generosity. Something older than both. He moved toward the door. Tony followed without quite knowing he was doing it, the way a man follows when he doesn't want a thing to end. At the door, the man stopped. He turned back. "There's one more thing," he said. Tony waited. "That scholarship. Your sister at Ohio State." Tony blinked. He hadn't mentioned his sister, hadn't mentioned Ohio State. Not a word. The man looked at him steadily. "How did you people talk in a town this size?" the man said. "They always did." He paused. "Don't let her quit. Not for this. Not for anything you can fix yourself." Tony stood very still. The man opened the door. The brass bell rang. He stepped out onto South 4th Street, turned up his collar, walked back across to the Gulf Station, got in, sat a moment with his hands on the wheel, started the engine, and pulled south toward the River Road. Tony stood in the doorway and watched the car until it disappeared around the corner by the river. Then he went inside, picked up the receipt, read it twice, and folded it into the green ledger, where the court notice had been 6 days before. He stood behind the deli case. He looked at his hands. He had stopped shaking. He reached under the counter and turned the slicer back on. He had a market to run. Stop here for just a second, because what happened next is the part of this story that almost no one knows, and it matters more than the money. Tony Caruso kept Caruso's market open. It took until the spring of 1962 to stabilize the accounts. A hard winter, a slow January, a February that nearly undid everything. But he kept the lights on. He kept the deli case stocked. He kept the tomatoes in the window when August came. In March of 1962, $40 money order to the Los Angeles address on the torn notebook page. In the memo line, South 4th Street, November 1961. A brief note came back from the manager's office. 2 lines, signed by a secretary. He kept that note too. Tony sent $40 in September, $60 in the following March, $100 after a good summer in 1963. He sent payments for 7 years, each envelope addressed to Los Angeles. each one carrying a small piece of that Tuesday morning back out into the world. In 1965, his sister graduated, came back for the summer, worked the counter, and learned to cut provolone thin enough to read a letter through. Tony taught her the black pepper trick, the one he hadn't known about until November of 1961 and had practiced every morning since. In 1968, Tony prepared a final money order for the remaining balance. He held it in his hand for 2 days before he mailed it. When he mailed it, it came back. Not refused. Not undeliverable. It came back in a plain envelope. No return address. The money order inside uncashed, and with it a single sheet of paper. 3 sentences, which was exactly as many as the man had ever needed. Tony, the account has been settled since the day your sister walked across that stage. Keep the market running. DM. Tony Caruso read that note at the counter of his father's market on a Tuesday morning in November of 1968, exactly 7 years from the day the marshal's truck had pulled up outside, and for a moment he could hear the chain hitting the concrete all over again. He read it once, he read it twice, then he set it down flat on the counter and stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at it the way a man looks at something he is not sure he deserves. He folded the note and put it in the green ledger. He did not tell anyone about it for a long time. He told his sister in 1971, the night before her wedding. She listened the way their father used to listen to the radio, and when Tony finished, she was quiet a moment. "Did you ever tell him thank you?" "No," Tony said. "Not in words. I think he knew," she said. Rosa Caruso died in 1978. Never fully knowing what had happened on that Tuesday, only that Tony had come upstairs that evening and seemed, she always said, like a man who had set something heavy down. Tony ran the market until 1989, closing it at 56, not because it failed, but because the building needed work he could not afford, and because his knees had begun to speak the way knees speak to men who have stood on concrete for 40 years. On the last morning, he stood behind the deli case and listened to where the slicer used to run. Before he closed it, he took 3 things from behind the counter. The green ledger, 40 years of penciled accounts, 7 years of loan payments near the back, and between 2 pages near the middle, a folded receipt on First Federal letterhead, and a 3-sentence note. His father's apron, white with the blue stripe, and from the wall of the back room, where it had hung since 1954, a photograph, black and white, slightly faded, of a young man in a tuxedo at a microphone, laughing at something just off camera. Enzo had cut it from a magazine and framed it and hung it there, and it had stayed through 27 years of flower dust and the close warmth of a room where a man works alone and listens to the radio, waiting, without knowing it, for one particular voice. On the back, in Enzo's careful block letters, "The Voice, best there is." Tony kept all 3 things in a box. In 1995, Tony Caruso died. His will directed that the box go to the Dean Martin Festival in Steubenville. Steubenville holds the Dean Martin Festival every June, in the streets of the town where Dino Crosetti was born in 1917, grew up, left, and came back to quietly, in ways that did not always make the papers. Tony's sister brought the box to the festival committee in 1996 and told them the story of the Tuesday before Thanksgiving in 1961. When she finished, the chairman asked to read the note. She gave him the ledger. He read it twice and then set it down very carefully, as if it were something that could still break. She said, "He never cashed it back. Not one payment. Not $1. The 3 items are part of the festival's permanent collection, displayed in a glass case in the exhibition hall under a small card, Tony's name, the dates, and a line from the note. The receipt is there. First Federal letterhead. Blue stamp in the corner. Howard Settle's signature in black ink. And it is still the only proof that any of it happened. The note is there. 3 sentences. The initials at the bottom in the loose, unhurried hand of a man who signed his name 10,000 times and never made it small. And the photograph is there. Enzo's photograph, slightly faded, slightly crooked. The young man at the microphone caught mid-laugh. On the back, the words Enzo Caruso wrote in 1954 without knowing what he was writing about. Without knowing that one Tuesday in November, the man in that photograph would walk into his son's market and set something in motion that would take 40 years to fully come to rest. The voice. Best there is. Every June, people come from a long way away to stand in the streets of Steubenville and remember a man who was born there and left and never quite left. Some of them stop at the glass case. Some of them read the card and move on without knowing exactly what they've read. Some of them stand there long enough to understand that the distance between a famous man and an ordinary one is sometimes just a counter, and a gray November morning, and a decision about whether to cross the street. If this brought back a memory or a thought you'd like to share, leave it in the comments. I read every single one and I reply to each one personally. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think.